back to D&D Beyond, and today I have roped in an expert to join me, a familiar face, if you will. Riley Silverman, we are going to talk through the wonderful article that you wrote up, the Spell Spotlight on Find Familiar today. So thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So for folks who might not have caught this, the link is running through chat or will be in the description, depending when and where you're watching this. But essentially, it's just a guide. What is the spell? How does it work? Who can use it? What are some things I might not have thought to do with it? So we're going to get into all that today, and then we're going to have a little bit of fun and poke around with some options. If you have questions, please send those through the chat because we have the bot up and running. But let's get right into it. Riley, what's Find Familiar?
Find Familiar is a spell that allows you to summon a spirit, essentially, that takes the form of typically an animal. There are some variations on that depending on what your class is or what your setting is and things like that. But basically, it's a creature. It's like a sprite. Essentially, it's either a celestial, fey, or fiendish spirit that can take the form of a little creature that can then essentially assist you or help you in various ways in D&D. And it's also a really fun little spell for some role play and stuff like that. So it's like having a magical pet. It's a little virtual pet for your D&D character.
Who can have this? Who can use this one?
So there's a lot of options for that. And primarily it's a wizard spell. That is like where it comes from. That's its main spot. There are some other classes that can do it. But usually there is some level of like variant rules or subclass kind of things involved in that. So the big ones there, as I learned from the chat and the comments as we post this, there are a lot of little ones that and like nooks and crannies and other like ways you can like daisy chain your way into having this spell. But your big ones are if you're a bard, you can use it by using magical secrets because one of the most underrated bard abilities, in my opinion, is magical secrets because it basically lets a bard take spells from any other class. So that can make some pretty cool stuff. If you want your bard to have Eldritch Blast, you can do that. If you want your bard to have Find Familiar, you can do that. With the druid, basically with the Tasha's Cauldron of Everything optional rules, so you have to partner with your DM to make sure those are in play for your game. You can actually expend a use of your magical secrets. That's bard. You can spend a use of your wild shape to cast to make a familiar instead of using a wild shape. There's also, of course, as a thief if you're a thief rogue at level 13, you can actually use magical items outside of your class requirements. And so you can actually use a spell scroll containing it. And of course, for warlocks, if you have the Pact of the Chain as part of your pact with your patron, then you actually get a special little familiar that actually can take different forms than most of the other familiars. And you can summon an imp, a pseudo-dragon, a quasit, or a sprite. And the nice thing about the Warlock familiar with Pact of Chain is you actually can attack, which normally familiars cannot.
Yes, so that's a big difference. Most folks, when they summon their familiars, it can do basically anything except attack. But warlocks specifically can have little battle pets. And also, just because I love this piece of art, I've pulled up the Wild Companion optional feature for druids from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, because I just think it's rad. But that is an automatic Fey type. It disappears after a number of hours as opposed to a standard companion, which lasts until it hits 0 hit points or you dismiss it. And it's
but the trade-off there is that there's no components required because the actual spell, when you use it as a spellcaster, there's actually not only is it a material component, it's one that has a GP cost to it. So it is not a free spell to cast, whereas as a druid, it actually is a free spell because you don't need the components to cast it.
So that's a great point. What else should we know about using the spell? Obviously, it's not actually free. You can't replace, because those material components have a cost, you can't just use your spellcasting focus to do this. So especially different games will track this stuff differently. But if you are playing in a game where you're paying attention to how much gold you have, you want to take this into account. It is a ritual spell. Which gives you some options about putting into play. It does take an entire hour to cast.
Yes.
So you're going to want to prep that. What else should we know as we're deploying it, Riley?
I'm trying to think of what we didn't just cover there. I think there's a lot of things there. I think that I think it's something to think about when you are in different locations, especially on different planes of existence, because your familiar might actually take on some pretty wild different form. Like if you are in Avernus, for example, and you're so used to your little fluffy bunny familiar, you're going to be in for a big surprise when you go to cast that spell. I believe it's an imp when you're in Avernus. It's something along those lines. It's either an imp
It is.
or yes, it is an imp. Yeah.
And there is an optional one. It's a little bit spoilery, but further on in Avernus, you might even pick up another option.
Mhm.
But I love you'll find a lot of the setting books or the various adventures and different settings will give you suggested alterations and options. So, for instance, in Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, your find familiar modification can be an imp and you'll see a list of these that you covered nicely in the article of some other options that are out of the box choices, including one I got very excited about. So if you're in Twitch chat today and looking for those giveaways, we're giving away some Tomb of Annihilation because that gives you two more options for familiars in the form of the Almirage and the Flying Monkey. Two of the
Yes.
most adorable additions to your D&D game, which I am going
And
to pull
shout
up
out
just
to our
because they're
community
cute.
because that's actually one that I didn't know about, and somebody in the comments put it in, so we added it to the article. So thank you to the community because I already had Storm King's Thunder and Icewind Dale in there, but I did not know about that one, Tomb Annihilation, because I have not played that adventure, so it did not pop out in my head as one to look at.
First of all, top 10 cutest monsters. Almirage is one of them for sure. And let's pull up that flying monkey art because it's also the cutest. Hmm? Look at that.
I'm a little partial to the Tressum cat from Storm King's Thunder because I like a flying cat. So it was like best of all the worlds in my mind.
We will get one more. That's not where you click. Hmm? So you do have some amazing
Yeah.
options, but while we're talking about options, you have a set of basic options that come with the Find Familiar spell,
Yes.
which are bat, cat, crab, frog, and or toad, hawk, lizard, octopus, owl, poisonous snake, fish, quipper specifically, rat,
Mhm.
raven, seahorse, spider, and weasel. Now, why might you want one or the other of these other than the fact that they are an adorable variety of Animal Kingdom choices?
I think it really would depend on what environment you're planning on using them in. For example, if you're playing in Call of Netherdeep, which we know has an underwater component to it, you might have a little more luck with an octopus familiar if you're sending it outside of whatever vehicle you are in or whatever location you're in than you might if you sent a raven or a cat or a dog. Like it might not be as much fun for them. So that's a good thing there. I think also having a flying familiar like a hawk or an owl will be very useful for you if you're using your familiar as a way of keeping guard while you are on you're basically on your watch during a long rest or while you're traveling. Might be useful if you have a wizard in your party that has a familiar and you have a cart. Maybe toss that wizard in the cart, let them fly around for a while looking through the eyes of their familiar as a way of keeping an eye on stuff. So that's a big one. So and then I mean there's one particular one that has a strategic advantage, which is the owl, because the owl has an ability called flyby. So this is why owls are one of the more popular familiars. Somebody in the comments made a great joke about how the spell name is actually find owl, but owls have flyby, which allows them to distract an enemy and then fly away without invoking attack of opportunity. So as long as your DM doesn't target your owl, you can have your owl fly in and out of the battlefield and distracting people while people are trying to fight. And so you can give at least one essentially free advantage on an attack every round of combat with that. So
Now, there are, I love that you brought that up. There are a few things you can do with this spell that we haven't mentioned yet. You can summon that pet. In most cases, it can't attack for you, but as you've discussed, there are a few ways that you can get battle pets into action. But of course, they have some other things they can do. You mentioned that you can see and hear through their senses, as long as they're within
yes,
100 feet of you, I believe.
yeah,
And
I think that's the
you
limit.
can deliver spells through them. Riley, how do those features work?
So essentially, if you have a spell that would normally require a touch distance, you can basically have your familiar touch that object or target instead of you, and it counts as a touch spell. So as long as your familiar was within range, then you can essentially drop some spells, which can be very useful if you have an attack spell that requires a touch, or a healing spell that requires a touch, or anything along those lines, or a buffer. And so, yeah.
So delivering spells, seeing through their senses. What happens if somebody, heaven forbid, attacks your cute little pet?
They're not going to last long. That's the drawback of a familiar, and that's why you don't want to be too cavalier with the harm's way that you put your familiar into, because they're all around a challenge rating 0 creatures, for the most part, and they're going to have maybe a hit point, maybe 2 if you're lucky. And so basically one good hit to your familiar and they're going to out of existence. But the nice thing is, with 10 gold pieces and the material components, a new familiar can be yours the next day. So, or really the next hour you're willing to cast the spell. So, as long as you have a little patience and you have some deep pockets, you can get your little buddy back.
Now, I also love that when you bring it back each time, you get to choose the form anew, right?
Yes. Yeah, you're
And
not
so you
locked
can.
into any form. And actually, you can even recast the spell while your familiar is currently active and change its form as well. I mean, it's essentially the same thing mechanically, but storytelling wise, you can be like, oh, I want to change this dude's shape, so I'm going to change that.
Fantastic. So, as you mentioned earlier, warlocks get access to a few different forms when they choose the Pact of the Chain. Um, and that is going to enhance your sort of options there. I think there's a list
Yeah,
of them: imp,
and
pseudo
warlocks can
dragon, quasi,
also,
and sprite.
yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Warlocks can also.
Warlocks can also use their bonus action to allow their familiar to attack. So which can be useful in combat, because if your party is spread out, you can have your little familiar buddy attack somebody from across the room. So you might not get a ton of damage, but it's better than not being able to use one. So
Absolutely. So this article also includes some tips. There are a few different creative ways that you could give anyone or a non-spellcaster access to Find Familiar, which are some fun suggestions to bring a magical little pet into your life, and a few other suggestions for accessing it and forms that it can take. Riley, why is Find Familiar worth having?
I think it's a pretty valuable. But I think, first of all, for pure role play level, it's a fun spell to have, because you're giving yourself an animal buddy, a companion, but you're kind of not dealing with the squishiness. Like, it's still squishy, but it's like a replenishable squishiness versus a like kind of sadness if you just have a pet that dies in game. You're like, well, that's sad. Whereas this is like a pet that dies and then it's just like comes back and it doesn't cost that much. So it's kind of nice. I mean, it can add up if you're really cavalier with it, but otherwise it's fine. So that's useful. I also think that for other classes aside from wizards, there's a lot of benefit to having a familiar. I mentioned earlier the thing with using the touch spell as a way of casting a spell. I think that if you have a healer in your party and they have a familiar, I think it is going to make it a lot easier for the healer to be able to give some higher level healing spells that require touch without having to maybe like be as close to somebody. So if you have a good fighting strategy, you can now deliver like that essentially heals on wheels by sending your little companion over to do it. So I think that's helpful. I also think there are some classes aside from wizard that might benefit more from being able to do like surveillance type things, or if you have a roguish type bard, or you have that kind of thing. I think having somebody who is sneaking into a situation instead of having to have like if you're using a thief rogue and you have a familiar, or you're using a bard that has a familiar, it's probably easier for you to, because you can telepathically uh, speak to your familiar and you communicate back and forth with it. So it's like almost like having a silent walkie-talkie for somebody like peeking around corners. You can have someone scout ahead that's not as noticeable and kind of infiltrate something, and you don't have to worry about speaking to another creature. Or and also with a wizard, if you're or any with a spellcaster, if you are seeing and hearing through the familiar's eyes and ears, you are ostensibly blind and deaf in your physical form. So if you, for example, if your wizard sends a familiar ahead of time and is trying to convey information to the party, they might not know they're speaking very loudly, or they might not know if you can't ask them questions like what's happening now because they can't hear you. Whereas if you are the scout, you don't really have that same limitation because you can just take a step back, hide in a shadowy place, send your little spider or whatever out to look at stuff, and then you can just catalog your information yourself.
So yes, make sure you have somebody watching your back or a very safe place to hide before you go out and use the senses of your familiar. But that is a glimpse at what you can do with this. Fantastic. This spell is in the basic rules, so anybody can look up and read about this one. But obviously, there are a bunch of wonderful ways to put it into action, options for your familiars as you bring them into your D&D game. And that article with all that info is running through chat or down below in the description. Thank you so much, Riley. EMT-Man asks, what familiar do you think is most underused? If you could, what change would you make to the creature to make it more appealing to the community?
And that one actually comes with its own special, unique to that familiar power, which is that if you and your familiar are up to 60 feet away, you can swap places with them. I'd like to see an Owlin cast an owl familiar just so they could do the meme of "Don't talk to me or my son ever again."